How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
You guys see all the boobs in this movie?
There were some.
I got the G-rated version, so I missed like all of the stuff. I got
They're drawn exactly like you would draw boobs if you were like a 14-year-old.
Are they all Gary, in the version you saw, they all wearing tankinis?
Yeah, exactly.
I gotcha.
Oh man. And the other thing is it weird? Well, I guess I should probably just start the show. I suppose we could do that if you guys wanted. I don't know if anybody's interested.
Say your thing.
What is my thing?
Hello.
Yeah. Well, hello. And welcome to Cinema Shock, a podcast dedicated to the history and evolution of cult and genre movies. I am Gary Horde. What are the
I'm Justin Bishop, and we're joined today by cartoon boob enthusiast, Mr. Todd A. Davis.
Hi. Aren't we all though?
Aren't we all? Yes.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, I was quickly reminded why I liked this movie when I was a child.
Let's be honest. We've all taken the Jessica Rabbit test.
There's a test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you see the scene, and then someone goes, "How do you feel about that?"
Yeah, the difference is like Jessica Rabbit. I mean, I can't believe we're going to have this conversation. Jessica Rabbit is still hot, and her boobs are very motion sensitive. And these women's boobs look like they would fucking murder you.
That's true. I mean, although they said for the design of Jessica Rabbit that they actually gravity work, they actually planned it so that gravity would actually work in reverse for her, so that she is actually an impossible woman. So, but I imagine, well, I mean, they rotoscoped so much of this, so I imagine it's closer to reality, although it's very far from reality.
I've seen the like the rotoscope over the footage of the rotoscope over the model, the actress, and they took some liberties.
Yes, they did.
All right, folks. So this week on the show, we are continuing our series on the career of Dan O'Bannon. And this is going to be a fun one. This is going to be a fun movie to talk about. I think it's our first animated film. And it's one that, Dan O'Bannon had, only a small contribution to, but an important contribution, I think. And I think it's still an important step in his career. And his career has been pretty interesting. The more that we learn about Dan O'Bannon, the more interesting his career seems. And the more and more I realize how he kind of had his hand in so many different projects, so across so many different even venues, like not just film, but as we're going to talk about today, and in comic books as well. I think it's really cool. For a guy who created a movie as big as like Alien, though, he never really reached that level of success again. Or at least he never had his singular vision hit the screen quite in the way that one did. Because, as we've discussed, just for a little recap, his version of the Alien script was changed pretty drastically. But he is the guy who came up with the main concepts alongside with Ronald Shusett. He's the guy who got H.R. Giger involved. He's essentially the creator of Alien, even though the what finally hit the screen wasn't 100% Dan O'Bannon.
I mean, it's kind of hard when you set the bar that high.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, that's a hard one to replicate. It's a hard success to replicate.
They tried multiple times.
Yes. Yeah. But for a lot of O'Bannon's career, he was the guy who was just like so close to the spotlight, without ever quite being in it. He had his hands in a lot of movies, often in very small ways, like when he worked on the computer graphics for Star Wars. Like, yeah, technically he worked on Star Wars, but just kind of,
Yeah.
And that's the case with the movie we're talking about this week as well. This week we're talking about a cult animated film based on a cult comic book, one that O'Bannon occasionally wrote for. And the movie version just so happens to use two different segments that he wrote. That movie, of course, we've already talked about it a little bit in our intro, but it is 1981's Heavy Metal.
Columbia Pictures presents Heavy Metal. A trip beyond the future to a universe you've never seen before. A universe of mystery. A universe of passionate fantasies. A universe of terrifying evil. A universe of magic. Heavy Metal. Heavy Metal. A step beyond science fiction.
The heavy metal in this movie just feels like good old fashioned rock and roll.
Oh, you mean the music specifically?
Yeah. The music.
With Open Arms by Journey is not what I would consider heavy metal.
Right.
Also, to think about
I don't think it would have been considered heavy metal at the time. None of this would be considered. I mean, maybe there's some Black Sabbath in there, but that's even more hard rock than heavy metal. Heavy metal as we think of it now, I don't think really quite existed at this time, at least not much.
No, but you can definitely see where maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse here, but I feel like this is, well, it was very influential for a lot of different projects, but I kept thinking of Metalocalypse. I was like, man, this is totally set the foundation for.
Well, I think they both
things
use,
like Metalocalypse.
I think they both use some of the same type of art as inspiration, like that, like those album covers, those like prog rock album covers, which a lot of this is very inspired by, or was very inspired by this. But so before we discuss the Heavy Metal movie, we of course have to talk about the Heavy Metal magazine. I went down a rabbit hole looking up heavy metal. I've always been fascinated by it, and it's got a pretty fascinating history. Todd is just grinning at us and showing his collection of heavy metal magazines on the screen that you guys can't see, but he's very proud of them.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
I always remember thinking that it was kind of like a forbidden comic book when I was a kid, because it was. I mean, it was for adults. I'm sure that if I went to a comic book store as like a 14-year-old, they probably would have sold it to me, but if my mom had found it, she probably would not have been very happy about it. So,
we're making this kid into a man, showing him these heavy metal titties.
Robot boobs.
Yeah, I mean,
boobs.
Yeah.
So
Heavy Metal, the magazine, it started out as a licensed translation of a French science fiction magazine called, and please pardon my shitty French, as I'm going to probably fuck this up, but Metal Hurlant. Does that sound right? Does that sound French? Did I sound French when I said that?
A little bit.
Okay.
It's so weird. Like I just got the taste of a baguette in my mouth, like right as you said that. So odd.
You had Justin's baguette in your mouth?
You heard me.
But that name literally translates to howling metal, which is a fucking cool name, honestly. Howling metal sounds more metal than heavy metal.
It does.
In the mid-1970s, a publisher by the name of Leonard Mogul was in Paris to jumpstart the French edition of National Lampoon magazine when he discovered this magazine. Metal Hurlant was created in 1974 by comics artists Jean-Pierre Dionne and Jean Girard, who we've discussed here on the show in the past, better known under his pen name of Mobius. Of course, we know that he was a collaborator of Dan O'Bannon's, both on Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune and briefly on Alien. We didn't discuss that a whole lot on our Alien episode, which is wild since we talked for like 4 fucking hours on that one. But he did do some concept drawings for Alien as well. In fact, one of the more influential stories that appeared in Metal Hurlant was one that was written by O'Bannon and illustrated by Mobius called The Long Tomorrow, which we'll get to a bit more here in a bit. But the two had started working on that story during their time together in Paris while they were working on Dune. But the final product, which was published in 2 issues of Metal Hurlant in 1976, has been incredibly influential in the world of cyberpunk. The Long Tomorrow is quoted by a lot of people as being a major influence, especially in cyberpunk stuff. Designs from that, inspired everything from Blade Runner to Tron to The Abyss. Philip K. Dick himself has quoted Heavy Metal magazine and very specifically The Long Tomorrow as a major influence on his work.
Oh yeah, so, I mean, you can see that in damn near every one of his stories.
Yeah, for sure. So Leonard Mogul and National Lampoon, they purchased the rights to publish the magazine in the U.S. under the name Heavy Metal. And it was just, a translation at the time. They were using these comics that were written and drawn by French artists, and they were translating them in English. That's basically what Heavy Metal was. And publication for Heavy Metal began in April of 1977 as a glossy full-color month. It wasn't the size, I don't know, for any of our listeners who have not seen a Heavy Metal magazine, it is designed as like a magazine, not as a comic book, if that makes sense. It's bigger, glossier. It's the size of a magazine, not the smaller size of a comic book, which is a great way to kind of highlight the art and to kind of make it stand out as something different. And because it was originally a translation of a French publication, the magazine wasn't bound by the Comics Code Authority. The Comics Code Authority at the time had a lot of power in the 1970s. And therefore, because it was not under the power of the Comics Code Authority or under their rule, they were allowed to feature explicit content that wasn't allowed in traditional American comics. And I also have to wonder if the format of being a format of a magazine instead of a comic book, a quote unquote comic book, had something to do with that as well.
Most likely. I think because of the cover illustrations alone have always been less cartoony than the average comic book.
And they're more like paintings.
Yeah. And with the wide format, and it was always, included with the magazines, as opposed to the comic books, it was generally out of sight, out of mind of most kids.
Even though it was young essentially kids. A comic book.
Yeah.
While the magazine initially featured stories written by and drawn by European comics creators, it would eventually evolve to include North American contributors like Richard Corbin, Bernie Wrightson, and of course, Dan O'Bannon. So by 1979, the magazine also began to feature text material in the form of short stories. And by 1980, it was featuring work by well-known sci-fi authors like William Gibson, Harlan Ellison, and William S. Burroughs, Stephen King. I mean, like very well-known guys. And it would later even feature interviews with pop culture figures, guys like Roger Corman, Federico Fellini, John Waters. All these guys were being interviewed by Heavy Metal magazine, which also makes it a little bit distinctive from your typical comic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in 1981, Heavy Metal made the jump from the pages to the big screen. So in the late 1970s, National Lampoon magazine, which we'll get into a deeper history of National Lampoon, I think, later on down the line as we maybe discuss some of their films.
Oh, yeah.
Because they've got a very long and very interesting history, just as a magazine before they even got into making movies. Mm-hmm. But they had their first success in the film industry with the release of John Landis's Animal House. If you really want a little bit of background on that, we did an episode on Animal House on our old podcast way, way early on. It's probably a bad episode compared to hopefully what we're doing now. But I do know that we discussed a little bit of the history of the magazine back in that episode. So if you scroll far enough back into our archives, you might be able to find that. But Animal House was produced by a guy named Ivan Reitman. You guys probably know Ivan Reitman's name now, but at the time he was more of a producer. He had actually got his start. Ivan Reitman, who's Canadian, got his start with a couple of like early David Cronenberg movies, like Rabid, and Rabid and Shivers, both of which are far from being comedies, both of which were actually produced by Ivan Reitman. But with Animal House's success, they figured, National Lampoon, they're like, we might as well try to make a movie version of the other magazine that we own. Like we have the rights to it. It's ours. So they asked Reitman to spearhead the project because they were happy with his work on Animal House. So Reitman approached screenwriters Daniel Goldberg and Lynn Bloom, who had just worked on Reitman's directorial debut Meatballs and would soon do the same with his follow-up film Stripes, both of which are, of course, classic comedies.
Oh, yeah.
So Reitman gave them copies of the magazine to see if they could kind of work, look through the story, see if we can work out a screenplay and make this work as a feature. The problem was that they couldn't get the rights to all of the stories. A lot of the original writers were in France So they had to go to France to get the rights to each story. And a lot of those were not owned necessarily by the magazine. They were still owned by the creators. These were creator owned stories. So they'd have to try to convince some of these guys, hey, let us use this for our film as well. And at the time, so this is the late 70s, early 1980s, there weren't a ton of like animation studios, aside from Disney, of course, who were doing feature length work, long form animated films. So Reitman had to kind of figure out a way to go about getting the film animated. So he started looking at smaller boutique animation houses from around the world, and he ends up hiring each of these like different animation houses to do their own segment on the film. So a guy named Gerald Potterton was credited as the film's director. He's the director of Heavy Metal. He was kind of hired to oversee the entire process and hire the directors for each segment, because each segment had its own director. With a story this size, Potterton had no way to oversee everything, especially with animation houses from all over the world working on it. They had people working on it in London, Toronto, New York, France, Los Angeles. Like they're all over the place. So there's a director at each of these locations actually supervising each one. And it was made over the course of about 3 years with a budget of about $9.3 million, which, is significant, but not crazy for an animated film, even at the time. Animated films are very expensive to produce. So I think as we discuss the film in more detail, I think the best way to do this, guys, is going to be kind of like we did with Creepshow back in our George Romero series. I think we just break it down one segment at a time, because they are vastly different and they vary greatly in quality sometimes as well. So I think the best way to do it is to kind of break it down one at a time.
And that's kind of the way the magazine is structured, so it works out.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to start off right away with Dan O'Bannon. So fittingly, the very first segment, which is not really a segment, it's really the title sequence. The title of it is Soft Landing. That's the name of the story that it's based on. But the story as it is really just a 2-page spread in Heavy Metal magazine. It's very, very short and there's no dialogue. So I'm curious as to what O'Bannon's script for it looked like, when he was writing the comic, because it's literally just like a Corvette hooked to a rocket that parachutes to Earth. But it makes for a really cool title sequence.
Oh yeah.
But the original, yeah, it looks cool. And the original comic was, of course, written by O'Bannon. It was illustrated by a guy named Thomas Warkentin, who I'm not super familiar with, but I have read quote unquote read this comic because this one's actually pretty easy to find online, and the artwork is pretty incredible and you can definitely tell that the animated version of it is very inspired by the art from the comic itself.
Oh yeah. And this, in terms of quote unquote writing this, since there isn't really any dialogue or anything really to read, for some reason it makes me think of Sin City, where Frank Miller just kind of was like, hey, I like this thing. I like this thing. I like this thing. I'm going to put them all together and just stick it out there. And it works. It's really cool.
It works as kind of a visual. Yeah. So the segment itself in the film was directed by John Bruno and Jimmy Murakami. John Bruno does a lot of work on this film. I think this is the only one that he's officially credited as director on, but he was sort of an art director for a lot of the film. But Murakami in particular had a pretty interesting career outside of this film. I went down a little rabbit hole looking him up, and he did a lot of work in animation, but he worked in live action as well. So in fact, the year before Heavy Metal was released, he had worked on 2 different Roger Corman productions. He served as the director on the New World Pictures Star Wars ripoff called Battle Beyond the Stars, which is one of the more famous Star Wars ripoffs out there. And he also did uncredited work on Humanoids from the Deep. So he actually directed both of those, or at least partially directed Humanoids from the Deep. But for this segment, the way that they did it is he actually shot a real Corvette suspended on a stage, on a gimbal, and then painted over it. He painted over the real Corvette. So it's kind of cool. It's a very cool looking segment, I think.
It looks amazing. And I was trying to figure out if they'd actually just used that footage, because the detailing is really great. I was trying to figure out exactly what technique they used.
It definitely looks very different from anything else in the film.
Mm-hmm.
It's been so long since I've seen this movie. I totally forgot about this segment. And then immediately the first thing I thought of was Elon Musk. So
Elon Musk was inspired by this.
Yeah, well, I was like, I found that out because I was like, did Elon Musk get inspired by this, or did Dan O'Bannon predict Elon Musk, or like what happened? But anyway, so there you go. The Tesla with Starman is orbiting around the sun as we speak. So thanks, Dan O'Bannon.
Yeah, I mean, like when I say he was inspired by it, like he fully claims that this was that him putting that Corvette on a rocket was inspired by heavy metal. Like Elon Musk has said that. It's I think when he actually tweeted about it, he actually made a heavy metal reference in his tweet. Elon Musk did, which is it's pretty wild. But yes, when I was watching it too, that was the first thing I thought of, so I had to go find out.
Yeah.
So the soft landing segment segues into a segment called Grimaldi, which is the name, I guess, given to the astronaut in O'Bannon's segment, because it kind of goes right into it and uses that astronaut as a character. And that's not based on any existing comic from the magazine. It was basically created as a framing device for the film. It was directed by Harold Whitaker, and this little segment really just gives us a reason to be introduced to the Lochnar, which is the name of this green orb that links the story in a weird way. It's a really weird framing device. Reitman and his screenwriters had wanted some way to link each segment so that they weren't just jumping from like one to another. So they somehow came up with this idea of this green orb that influences people throughout the story, and it seems to have different powers in each story. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, honestly. It's kind of silly. One of their early ideas for how to link them was like a carousel. I guess there was going to be like a carousel in this house, and each thing on the carousel was like part of, like, took you into a different story, which is interesting. They even storyboarded it, and I think maybe even did a rough animation of that, but for some reason just decided we're going to go with a green marble.
Yeah, I saw it in the special features on the Blu-ray, and it's an interesting presentation. I think that might have actually, if I had to choose between one or the other, I think the carousel would have been really cool.
I think it would have been really cool too. And I think the thing with the Lochnar is that they tried to make that part of each story, which sometimes feels a little forced in trying to integrate it into the plot of each of these stories. Because like I said, it makes sense in like the next segment we're going to talk about, because it's a major part of the plot. But in some of them, it's just like there, like in the Captain Stern sequence, like in some of them, it's just a little strange. But
it's almost like the devil really wants to bone this preteen girl. And it is like, he is just like hanging out in this room. Bitch, let me tell you how evil I am. Like, your parents are going to hate me. I'm the coolest. Like, this is some shit I've done. I do all the bad stuff.
The voice for the Lochnar, he doesn't get a credit in the film, but it's a guy named Percy Rodriguez. He's like a movie trailer voiceover guy. Nice. That when they were trying to cast that role, they heard this guy's voice. And they're like, we got to get this guy to be the Lochnar. And I don't know why he doesn't get credited in it, though. But yeah, that's weird. If his voice sounds familiar, it's because his voice is in a ton of movie trailers. in a world
he's like where that shit guy. Went south. It was probably my fault. Don't you understand? I'm crazy. I'm the Lochnar. I fuck it up.
Okay, cut. We're going to have to do that again.
Yeah, we can't say I fuck it up in the trailer.
He's the Lochnar.
Mr. Rodriguez.
I don't know why he keeps saying he's the Lochnar.
All right, you ready to go again?
Y'all heard of COVID? Lochnar. AIDS. Lochnar.
Do you need some water? Are you good? All right. We're going to run it again.
The Trump presidency. Lochnar.
We're never going to get this done.
Everything bad is blamed on the Lochnar. The next segment of the film is called Harry Canyon. And although O'Bannon doesn't get credit for this, it is based on that The Long Tomorrow comic that I mentioned earlier that he helped to create with Mobius. Although the Harry Canyon character, the main character in this, was original to the film. He's not in the original comic, but like that world, that futuristic New York, that's from the Mobius comic, The Long Tomorrow. And looks a lot like The Fifth Element, wouldn't you say?
Very much like The Fifth Element.
Like to the point where they should sue.
This is happening.
Like it feels like they should sue Luc Besson. Like it feels so much like The Fifth Element.
I'm going to be perfectly honest with you here. I'm not afraid to be the odd man out. I did not think about that until you just said it, and now I'm like, oh, holy shit, that is Fifth Element. I didn't even think about that at all.
It is 100% the Fifth Element. I mean, you can see a little bit of Blade Runner there too, but it's a little dirt. It's I guess it's not as dark as Blade Runner.
Oh, man, I just wish that there was a segment where Bruce Willis was just boning Mia Jovovich and saying like, "I'm gonna give her the stars and stripes forever." Just good old America.
And that's what he says when he climaxes.
Oh,
it's either that or Lochner!
Raise the flag. Look out, Lilo, I'm coming half-mast.
So this segment was directed by a Belgian animator by the name of, I'm gonna mess this up, so I apologize. Pino van Lamsweerde. Sure, that sounds like the way you say his name.
Yeah.
I'm not really familiar with him, but I looked up a few of these animators, and a lot of them were not necessarily animation directors outside of this, but a lot of them were just animators, you know, that worked for other directors. And a lot of them worked on a film called Tiki Tiki that was directed by Gerald Potterton. So I think he was just taking a bunch of guys who'd animated for him on another film and saying, hey, you get this segment, you get this segment, you get this segment, you know. I don't know that that's how it worked, but it sure does seem that way.
It's plausible. Yeah.
It also makes perfect sense now knowing who the director is, that's just probably how he viewed Americans. Like he just assumed all Americans thought this. I bet when they're fucking somebody, they say they're giving them good old American know-how.
It was also based on a comic. Based on a comic that was co-created by a Frenchman. So
yeah.
So this segment sees our first appearance of one of the SCTV alums that we'll see throughout the film. In this one, John Candy has a small role as the desk sergeant. You know, when he takes the unconscious lady to the police department, John Candy plays the desk sergeant there, who's like, so it's going to be like $1,000 a day to investigate this. Although the title character of Harry Canyon was voiced by an actor named Richard Romanus, who'd also worked on several of Ralph Bakshi's animated films and would later even have an occurring role on The Sopranos.
I think he was the Night Stalker.
That's Ramirez.
Oh, Richard
Ramirez. How did you guys like this segment?
I really dig this one. I love that noir. He's not a detective, but it's that whole
he plays the role that
that whole vibe. I dig that. And you know, when that sort of type of story is juxtaposed on a futuristic, super futuristic New York, it's a lot of fun. I dig it.
It's fun. This one also immediately tells you that heavy metal's not going to be shy with the gore, because he like just melts that dude in his back seat. Yeah. But I like this one a lot. I think the voice work is good, but I really like the animation style in this one. Mm-hmm. Animation style is going to change throughout these, and some are better than others. But this one, I just really like the look of the background. Like I like how detailed and like scratchy they all look. It feels like a Mobius comimic, honestly.
It's honestly my favorite one.
It's really good.
But I really dig this one, and I dig that. Well, now I'm less impressed now that I realize it's. Well, I guess I shouldn't be, but now that you pointed out that it's the Fifth Element, I'm like,
Fifth Element came later. You should be less impressed with.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I guess I should be less or more impressed that it created the Fifth Element. But
yeah, but I like their version of New York too. It's like shitty 70s New York, which is what the New York that existed at the time they were making this. Only now there are flying cars. There are still cabs on the ground, but there's also flying cars in the air. It's an interesting universe that they've created.
It's always a little eerie to see older films versions of the future.
Yeah,
where the Twin Towers are still standing. I always
do you see them in this?
Yeah.
Do you? I couldn't remember.
Yeah.
And it's always very
weird.
Strange. Yeah, very strange.
I still can't figure out. Like, this is really wrecking my world, man. Because I can't. One of the coolest things I always thought about with the Fifth Element. I'm sorry, I keep coming back to this, but is that Luc Besson? Like I remember like being in high school and hearing Luc Besson started writing this when he was 16 years old, and I'm like, man, that's so fucking brilliant. Luc Besson.
Yeah, he was probably reading Heavy Metal magazine.
I was like, he was jerking off to heavy metal is what he was doing.
Well, here's the thing we now know about Luc
she
Besson.
gets in the cab wearing a dress. Let's just make her wearing duct tape.
Because remember, I mean, and Luc Besson is French, so he was probably reading this in Metal Hurlant in the mid 70s. You know.
Yeah.
Also, let's remember that Luc Besson, we know, is a big piece of shit. So
yeah,
so it's easier to hate him.
It's easier to dismiss him, or it makes you feel better about it at least. So, all right, the next segment is called DUNE, and DUNE is based on a character of the same name created by a comic artist named Richard Corbin. This one has a pretty interesting history here. Richard Corbin had made a career of writing sci-fi and horror comics for books like Creepy and Eerie and Vampirella, and he originally created the character of DUNE for a short film called Neverwhere. So Neverwhere, which has no association to the Neil Gaiman book of the same name.
I was about to bring that up.
But it's the name of the alternate dimension that we see. You've got your nerdy protagonist, and then he travels and to this alternate universe and transforms into DUNE, the character of DUNE. But Neverwhere is like the alternate universe that he travels to. The comics, this one's probably got the longest history as a comic than anything else that we're discussing today. But in the comic, it's a pretty obvious nod to stuff like Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter books,
very much.
But when Corbin began writing comic stories about the character, he took that inspiration from John Carter and made it decidedly hornier. And this is easily the horniest segment of the film, but it's got nothing on the comic book. The comic book of DUNE is super horny. If you look up the character on Wikipedia, for instance, which I did, when you look up a comic book character, it'll list their list of like super abilities. Like if you look up Spider-Man, it's like abilities, can walk on walls, shoot web, whatever, super strength. For DUNE, when you look him up, it lists peak human strength, speed, durability, agility, reflexes, and senses, hand-to-hand combat, and being, this is a quote from Wikipedia, prodigiously sexually endowed. So yes,
what's that mean, Justin?
One of DUNE's superpowers in the canon of the comics is he's got a huge dong. That's his superpower.
Yep.
And I love the way that they show that in the film without showing his huge dongs. You just have him look down and going, big. Yeah. So the character of DUNE has a pretty long publication history, dating from his first appearances in the early 1970s all the way through the late 1990s, including a run as the star of his own comic book, which ran for 10 issues. So I'd really like to get a hold of some of these comics because the art looks really cool.
I
And
bet
like
that's
Richard
what you'd
Corbin's,
like to get a hold of.
Richard Corbin's got a really cool art style. He does a lot of airbrush work, so it all looks like prog rock album covers. It really does. It's really cool looking stuff. Like his landscapes and stuff are really cool. So this segment in the film was directed by Jack Stokes, who's a British animation director, who's probably most well known for his work on the 1968 Beatles film Yellow Submarine, which also Gerald Potterton worked on. So that's probably how they knew each other. And this time we've got John Candy here again. John Candy this time is the star of the segment. He plays DUNE, both versions. He plays both the nerdy, like teenage version and the big, bald, giant cocked version of DUNE.
So
what did you guys think of this segment?
This was fun. I will say that I was, it's very unfair that it's okay to show titties, but they couldn't show DUNE's huge dong. That was off limits for this film.
Yeah, that does seem like a double standard there.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Corbin wasn't he also the art? And I'm legitimately asking this because I don't have it right in front of me. The artist on like the Bat Out of Hell stuff. I feel like he was the same.
It would not
guy.
surprise me.
Yeah,
it's either him or
me, but I don't know.
Frazetta. I'm going to
Google it as we're talking.
But that very Frazetta-esque style that
it
straight on
him.
album covers and the sides
yeah.
of vans.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, he did do the Bat Out of Hell album cover.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's very cool. I did not know that, but that's
all of them, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. But yeah, so that kind of, if you know what the Bat Out of Hell cover looks like, which is iconic, then you kind of get an idea of what his art style is like. And in the comic, the character of DUNE looks a lot like what he looks here, but painted in a more realistic way, but still kind of cartoony in design. It's a very interesting style. It's kind of cool. Yeah, this segment's weird because I think this segment's very entertaining. I think the animation in this segment is the most inconsistent.
Yeah.
Because like Den, the look of his character changes from scene to scene. There's a lot in it it just feels inconsistent. But as a story, I think it's pretty entertaining. It's pretty fun. You could see how this could be an ongoing series.
I mean,
the villain was weirdly drawn. Sorry, Todd.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. I was actually just about to mention the villain. I feel like, if he came from Earth and the woman that he's with comes from Earth, it begs the question: who else is there from Earth, and what's the reason why, and all that stuff. But I kind of wish, there's definitely enough there to have a series. I think there's enough there to have its own feature film.
I think this is like basically an MMORPG before there were MMORPGs is what's happening. And so like this story predicted like fucking whatever that one was, World of Warcraft or something.
Yeah.
It was like they're there. So for a bunch of now I feel like just like I'm an asshole, but I was gonna say it just feels like a incel wet dream to be like, oh no, I'm a super buff dude with a huge dog and I'm gonna fuck people. And
it is 100% like teenage
male fantasy.
Teenage male fantasy, which if you watch the documentary, I think it's called Imagining Heavy Metal, the filmmakers fully admit that. They're like, this whole movie is male fantasy. Like what nerdy kid working on a science project wouldn't dream of like being, this big buff dude who all the ladies want, and he's a hero of a story and gets to defeat the evil villain. Like it's all male fantasy. That's why the women are drawn the way that they are in this. They're all drawn like a teenage boy would draw a woman, like very unrealistic. And it's but yeah, I think it's funny that like if you listen to the filmmakers in interviews, they're like, we are horny.
We all hung out in the studio. We were just like rock hard the entire time. I used my cock to trace the straight lines I needed.
So, okay, we've mentioned John Candy a couple of times, and you might be wondering, if you've watched this film, why there are so many well-known comedians in the film's cast. Well, at the time, they weren't super well-known. They weren't the stars that they would become just a few years later. But guys like, at the time, John Candy and Eugene Levy were members of Second City, which is a Chicago-based improv group. But in their native Canada, because these guys are all Canadian, Second City produced a highly influential television series called SCTV. That's where folks like Candy and Levy, Rick Moranis, that's where the McKenzie brothers originated. Catherine O'Hara, Martin Short, Harold Ramis, all of these people got their start on SCTV. So that begs the question, why did Reitman cast these comedians in his animated sci-fi fantasy film? It was because he knew them. They were his friends, and he had worked with them before, and he was comfortable working with them. And he knew that they had the talent to pull it off, even if they weren't known as voiceover artists. And that's pretty much the end of the story. That's pretty much like, he's like, yeah, these guys were my friends, and it was easy to get them to come do this. And it works because John Candy does like 5 different voices in this thing. And there's only one that really sounds like John Candy, and that's the robot that he plays later on.
Oh, yeah.
That one is just his like regular John Candy voice. Yeah. If you know that Den is John Candy, you can hear it, but he's definitely doing something different with his voice, as a lot of great voiceover artists do.
I don't imagine anybody is, but if you're unfamiliar with SCTV, it was kind of the precursor to Saturday Night Live. There was
definitely, yeah.
Way back when, it was kind of this was Canada's SNL. Yeah, they did a lot of great stuff, and a lot of those comedic actors, they're actors. They have really good chops, and they do a good job with this stuff. Plus, I think SCTV also did a lot of stuff on the radio. So a lot of them were kind of used to that sort of thing.
If you're unfamiliar with John Candy too, I mean, some of the younger listeners might not know him. He sadly passed away now, but he was also a very famous actor known for his huge cock.
Let's be the podcast that starts that rumor of John Candy and his massive cock.
I think this episode is already on record as having the most uses of the word cock.
We're gonna keep it going.
Do we need to go back to baguette? Should we revert back to baguette?
His wife constantly had to deal with him saying, "You want a piece of the double C? You know, candy cock." They tried to trademark that for actual treats, but it didn't work. So.
All right, so let's move on to the next segment. The next segment is called Captain Stern, and that's based on a character created by the great Bernie Wrightson. I'm sure you guys at least are familiar with Bernie Wrightson, but for any listeners who might not know, he's an incredible comic book artist, probably most well known for co-creating the Swamp Thing character for DC in the early 1970s. He also did an incredible illustrated version of Frankenstein that I would highly recommend picking up if you have a chance. I've got a copy of that. It was put out by Dark Horse Comics, but it's basically Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but with illustrations in between by Bernie Wrightson, like incredibly detailed. Nice. Illustrations. It's really great. I've got a big cloth bound version that actually is autographed by Bernie Wrightson because I met him at a comic con a few years ago before he passed away. Nice. Super sweet man, really sweet guy. It was really cool because it was cool and sad at the same time because this was like there were more well-known comic artists at this, or more well-known to modern comic fans at this convention. This was at Heroes Con in Charlotte a few years ago. And they all had long lines, Bernie Wrightson had nobody like in line at his table. He also didn't have like a big setup. It was just like a little tiny sign, but he was one of like two people that I was very excited to meet at this con. The other one was Jeff Darrow, who also had no line. But the cool thing was I got to sit and talk to them for a while, which was really cool. And I got to get their autographs and everything. But Bernie Wrightson has always been one of my favorite comic book illustrators because his style looks so unlike anyone else's.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry to revert back for a second, but I feel like the very first segment, Harry Cannon, is the style's very reminiscent of Jeff Darrow. I feel like it's got a lot of that to it. And I blanked on the name and I was just like, I don't know. But once you said that, I was like, oh yeah, that's it.
No, I actually very much agree. And Jeff Darrow, I don't think was really doing anything at the time. So wouldn't say it was influenced by him, but Jeff Darrow and Mobius's styles have always been pretty similar to me. Jeff Darrow does this thing where his panels are filled with details. Yeah. You could pour over a single page of a Jeff Darrow comic and pick out little details for an hour.
It's a Where's Waldo. Like every panel he does is a Where's Waldo. And
it's incredible. Well, and that honestly, that segment feels like Hard Boiled a lot, which is Jeff Darrow and Frank Miller, a comic they did in the 80s, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and to go back to your interaction with him at Heroes Con, I highly recommend when all this stuff gets back to normal, and you go to those cons, seek out the veteran creators. Yeah. Because first of all, like Justin said, unfortunately, more often than not, they're sitting there by themselves. There's no line.
Unless they're Stan Lee,
unless they're Stan Lee.
Now, but
well, I guess Neil
Adams.
Neil Adams is still doing his thing, and he's a nice guy. You can go talk to him for a while. But if they happen to be doing a panel, forget every other panel, go to that Legends panel and just listen to them tell stories about working in the industry. It's so great, and they have so much knowledge of working in this industry, and they'll sit there and talk to you all day, and it's really a lot of fun.
I just thought that was wild, man, because it's like this guy created Swamp Thing. He created Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
And
I didn't come into this episode knowing that I was going to be this guy, but I will also point out that Bernie Wrightson also did the cover art for Meatloaf's Dead Ringer album. So
did he really?
Yeah, he really did.
Wow, this is just turning into a Meatloaf appreciation.
I'm learning
episode.
now. I'm like, I don't know enough about Meatloaf. Apparently, he's like a comic book nerd or something.
I bet Meatloaf loved Heavy Metal Magazine.
Oh, he probably did.
Yeah.
Well, and Jim Steinman, who co-wrote Bat Out of Hell and a lot of stuff with Meatloaf, passed away last week.
Yeah, he just passed away.
He just passed away last week. Yeah, I don't know why this turned into a Meatloaf episode.
I don't either. That's it. This is not what I expected coming into this, but now I'm just kind of sad.
This whole movie does have a real Bat Out of Hell feel to it. Honestly, it really does. They're very much inspired by the same things. But anyway, back to Captain Stern. The Captain Stern character feels very different from the kind of work that Wrightson is most well known for, which included realistic and highly detailed pen and ink drawing. His illustrations of this character, if you look up, go Google Captain Stern comic, and you'll see images of this character, and they're still incredible and very highly detailed. They're just more purposely cartoonish. Like his face is clearly drawn as a parody of Superman.
Spit curl, big chin, the whole thing.
Yeah. So this segment of the film was directed by Julian Harris and Paul Sabella. No John Candy this time, but we do have a couple of other SCTV alum there, most notably Eugene Levy as Captain Stern himself, which I had no idea Eugene Levy was involved in this film till I saw the opening credits. Because probably the last time I saw this film, I didn't know who Eugene Levy was, because I was before I'd ever seen any of the.
Admit it. The first time you knew who Eugene Levy was when he was giving his son a lesson on fucking pies.
Well, that's probably true.
Yeah,
that is probably true.
No, it 100% is for me. I was like, that guy became memorable from there for me.
Yeah, because I'm sure I saw American Pie before I ever saw like Best in Show or any of the other great Christopher Guest movies that he was in. But he's got a long history as a comedian. I'm glad that Schitt's Creek at least has given him more mainstream exposure to people who only know him as the pie fucker's dad.
God, Schitt's Creek is so good.
It's really good. Outstanding. An actor by the name of Joe Flaherty plays the lawyer, and he is another SCTV star. And you might not know his name, but he's probably you know his face because he's the kind of guy you see pop up in a lot of stuff. Most people probably at least know him for his role in Happy Gilmore.
I was the guy. Isn't he in Happy Gilmore? Yeah.
Yeah, he's Jackass. He's that guy.
Oh yeah. Oh gosh.
So, and then you've got John Vernon, who played Dean Wormer in Animal House.
Mm-hmm.
He plays the prosecutor here. He's also the bad guy in Ernest Goes to Camp, I think, isn't he?
Yeah.
John Vernon, the construction foreman guy. But yeah, so he plays the prosecutor. So a lot of
need the chief to sign these papers.
All right. So, what did you guys think of this segment?
It's fun. There's definitely a more comedic vibe to this one.
It's a real bummer ending for the poor
hand over fist.
Yeah, head over fist.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all.
Well, that's because the main character is a jerk, but he does. This segment is really interesting to me. It does feel very cartoony, obviously the whole movie is a cartoon, but the way the characters are drawn, they look like caricatures more than I think any other segment in the film, which is going for realism, with the rotoscoping and stuff. This one though, it's pretty fun. I like the character designs a lot. I would not have minded seeing more films with like this character. Like I wish that Heavy Metal had like sequels.
Like direct
it did have a sequel
sequels.
eventually, but where some of these segments like Den and like Captain Stern we were able to see more stories with those characters later on. And that would have been kind of cool.
Yeah.
That would have been kind of neat. So this segment ends with, you've got hand over fist, cut off hand that is flying towards Earth, holding the Lochnar as in a marble size, Well, that segment was originally supposed to
blind after masturbation, Lochnar. Sorry.
That segment was originally supposed to segue into a segment called Neverwhere Land. Did you guys see this on the Blu-ray?
I did.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I wish that they'd done it. I understand why they didn't, because it slows down the pace of the film.
Mm-hmm.
But basically this segment, it starts with that. It starts with the hand going down, and it goes down to Earth, and it hits like a primordial pool, right? And essentially everything, it's a 1.5 minute long segment that goes through the history of the planet, everything from like the dinosaurs going extinct to the rise of like the Nazis, like, and everything in between, like everything that's happened on Earth is showing that the Lochnar has influenced all that, which is a cool concept, especially in the context of the rest of the film. And I don't know, obviously, what the final animation would have looked like, but if you look at the rough sketches for the animation, the style is pretty fucking cool. Yeah. And it would have been really cool to see how they would have translated that to animation.
As it is, the rough animation is phenomenal.
Yeah.
It looks really great. I was like,
It's really
can't
cool.
they just clip this into the film?
Yeah, I know. It was done by a guy named Cornelius Cole was the artist, and the original rough animatics were actually set to a loop of the beginning of Pink Floyd's Time from Dark Side of the Moon, right?
Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think on the version that's on the Blu-ray, it's got another piece of music on it, but
Yeah,
that was what they originally set it to. It's a really cool segment, and I do wish that they would have included it, but at least you can see the rough animatics of it on the Blu-ray. I mean, it's been released on home video releases of heavy metal since the original VHS release. The original VHS release, like if you watched the whole movie, at the end of the credits, they would show the rough animatics of this sequence as like a special feature. Man. So the way that the segment was supposed to end was with the rise of Hitler, and then that segues into World War II, which brings us to our next segment, and so you've got this image of Hitler, and then the camera kind of pans up, and then you see these B-17 bombers fly over, which is the beginning of our next segment, which brings us back to Dan O'Bannon. So since this is a Dan O'Bannon series, let's rewind a little bit to talk a little bit about where this particular segment might have come from with Dan O'Bannon. So we're gonna rewind a little bit to back when he was writing that memory script. Remember the one that would eventually turn into Alien we talked about for like 4 hours that day? So if you recall, Dan O'Bannon was kind of stuck after writing about half the script. So he went to his friend Ronald Shusett for advice on where to go with the story. And Ron said this: "Well, remember you told me an idea you had once for a movie? It was the one where gremlins get on a B-17 bomber during World War II and give the pilots a lot of trouble. So why don't you make that the second half and put it on a spaceship?" So after he told Dan that, he kind of put a light bulb went off in his head, and the structure of the screenplay kind of wrote itself at that point. Instead of gremlins on a B-17, it was a killer alien on a spaceship. But that's kind of where the idea came from. Although obviously, a lot had to be changed when the format changed. But that gremlin idea is one that he would end up going back to. It was an idea that was based on stories that Dan had heard growing up about gremlins that would damage airplanes. It was an idea that had inspired stories in the past, most notably in the Roald Dahl book called Gremlins that was published in 1943. But this was kind of a story that was it originated around World War II with World War II pilots and bomber pilots. And they would kind of blame everything on gremlins, kind of tongue in cheek, blame everything on gremlins. And, so Dan O'Bannon takes this idea and he reworks it into his segment for heavy metal, which was originally actually about gremlins attacking a crew of a B-17 bomber before it kind of turned into a zombie story at some point in development. And this one was not written as a comic book piece. I don't think. I could not find any information about this actually being a comic. Dan O'Bannon wrote comics for heavy metal, but this one seems to have originated as a script specifically for the animated film. And this might be my favorite segment of this whole movie, I think. I mean, it's hard to pick. There's a couple. I like the Harry Canyon one a lot. I like the Tarna one that comes at the end, but this one it's got a cool feel to it. It feels very different from the rest of it because it doesn't take place in some far off world or in the future or anything like that, like every other segment in this does. But this one feels more than any other one to me like it could have been adapted from an EC comic. Yeah. It feels like an episode of like Tales from the Crypt or even the Twilight Zone, Yeah,
I was just about to say it's kind of like an EC comic meets Twilight Zone.
It really is. And it also features O'Bannon's first foray into the world of zombies, unless you count the undead townsfolk and dead and buried as zombies, which I don't know that I do. I don't think they're just undead, but not zombies. I think zombies have to be like corpses. I mean, I guess they're corpses.
Yeah.
Is Dead and Buried a zombie movie? Did we discuss that last week?
I think it is.
But they don't eat brains and they don't eat flesh. No. Zombies are flesh eaters.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's differences like the I would call them the Romero undead. Zombies are like walkers versus like, the 28 days later where
But they're still all
where they
flesh
sprint
eaters.
at you. Yeah, they're
But
still flesh eaters.
I would say they're the undead, because like Frankenstein is undead, but not what we would call a zombie. The Dracula is undead, but not what we would call a zombie.
Yeah, that's
Frankenstein
That's
would have been. O'Bannon would be a huge fan of like Frankenstein style stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what did you guys think of this segment?
Oh, I really dig this one. It's,
I love the animation style again.
I was gonna say from that first pan around of the bomber, it kind of invokes the that look from the Corvette at the beginning of the in the
well, it was done in a
title
very similar fashion, actually.
Yeah.
So a lot of heavy metal uses a technique called rotoscoping. For those unfamiliar with this specific type of animation, it's something that you see its history goes back to the beginning of animation. I mean, Snow White uses rotoscoping, but it was used a lot in the animated films of this era, like the 70s and early 80s, including those by cult animation director Ralph Bakshi, who I've referenced him twice already in this episode. But I think we're probably going to have to do a whole series on Ralph Bakshi at some point down the line, because this stuff is really cool.
Yeah.
But basically, the process of rotoscoping includes you shoot footage of real people, models or actors on film, and then you trace the shot to animate it, basically. So you're getting all the movement from the footage, even though it's not 100% like an exact tracing all the time. It's a really interesting process and gives a very specific feel to the animation, I think.
Yeah, because I was looking at it and I was like, it's a really good way to go. But if done wrong, it looks really bad, so it's funny to think of. You would think, all you have to do is just shoot the actor. You don't have to worry about anything. No, you really kind of have to get the lighting right, because if you don't get those shadows and that texture, it's just going to look like flat blobs on the screen, and it's just not going to work well. It might move like a person, but it's not going to look like.
Sure, there's still a lot of actual animation. It's not like it's not necessarily a shortcut by any
right
means.
Yeah, I think that's the misconception, is that people think it's a shortcut. It's not
a shortcut. There's still a lot of work involved in it.
Yeah.
It gives a more realistic form of movement, I think. But in this segment specifically, the B-17 segment, and they do this a couple of times in the movie, but I think this is the first time we've seen it so far, is they actually shot the bomber itself, like the actual airplane, using a 10-foot replica. They built this big model of the B-17. So it's similar to how they did with the Corvette, except in the Corvette sequence, they shot an actual Corvette, like put it on a gimbal and moved the camera around an actual Corvette, which is why it looks a little bit more like a photograph, I think. But in this, what they did is they made a 10-foot replica of the B-17. They painted it black, and then they put white lines all around it. White lines as sort of the outlines of what you would see as a black line on the screen. So what they did is basically they shot it using a camera. They moved the camera all around it as if they were filming the movie, but then they reversed the negative. So all those white lines in the blackness of the bomber itself were reversed to where the bomber itself was white, so that they could draw and paint over it, and the black lines remained as the black lines that you see on the screen. It's why that gives it almost a 3D look to the airplane footage. It's really cool.
Yeah. A lot of really great texture pops up, especially if anybody's like on the fence, go get the Blu-ray. Like this looks amazing in Blu-ray.
I love the look of the zombies too.
Yeah.
I think they look cool.
If you say texture one more time, I'm gonna get rock hard right here on this show. No, I don't know what it is with me and penis. I think heavy metal really brings that out in me.
You are obsessed a little bit with the penis,
Gary.
Gary.
Something's awakening in
something
Gary.
has awakened.
Is it the Lochnar, Gary?
We'll blame it on the Lochnar.
Gary, what did you think of this segment?
Lochnar. No, I thought it was really good. I mean, this is one of my favorite ones. So I guess it's a testament to Dan O'Bannon that probably like the ones he worked on the most are my favorite segments, actually.
Yeah.
So something about him appeals to me at that level, I guess. But
I mean, we've talked about his love of EC comics in the past, and I think this really shows it. I mean, I feel like Dead and Buried, we discussed that feeling like an EC comic, or like it could be out of Creep Show. This does too. This feels like it could be like, I've been watching the Creep Show TV show on Shudder, and this feels like it could be an episode of that. It just has, there's something about that twist ending, where the guy finally escapes the bomber, parachutes out, and then lands in a airplane graveyard, basically, where all these other zombies come out. It's a great segment, and it's really cool. It's a really great ending. I just love this one. I really like everything from the animation style to the story. I just think it's really fun. The whole vibe of this one just speaks to me.
I was reading something about and I never got to find out if they got to an actual resolution, and maybe this is more of an end thing, but Dan O'Bannon's art in this one was a big deal, and there in the recent heavy metal series, apparently some of that artwork shows back up, and there was even a they were putting out merchandise or something with
in more recent heavy metal magazine, they used they wrote another B-17 story, basically using not necessarily the original art, but the original concepts created by Dan O'Bannon based on that original art.
But they weren't giving credit to O'Bannon.
Right. Yeah, I know. I read a couple of articles on like Bleeding Cool about it, where Dan O'Bannon's widow was having to have some litigations, I think, with Heavy Metal Magazine over it.
She was saying, I would welcome a word with these folks that are using his art.
Yeah. So this one also uses, I think, pretty notably, a pretty rad theme song for the movie. I mean, there are two songs in this called Heavy Metal, but I like this one is called Heavy Metal (parentheses Taking a Ride), and it's by Don Felder, who I think was like a guitarist for the Eagles, wasn't he? Wasn't Don Felder a guitarist for the Eagles? Probably should have looked that up, but I'm pretty sure he was. But yeah, so I mean, we haven't talked much about the music in this film, but I think he was.
Yes.
Okay. So
sorry, I had to double check myself, but yes, he was.
So obviously music's a huge part of this movie. It's a movie called Heavy Metal. Although, as we joked about before, none of this music is what we would consider heavy metal, but the soundtrack is really good. Like really good. I found this one on vinyl a few years ago, and it was like, I know it's pretty easy to find on vinyl, but it was like cool to just find it out in the wild, not looking for it.
Nice.
And I don't know, every segment of this features several modern, at the time, modern bands, many of whom contributed original songs for the film. You've got Devo, Devo voices one of the bands that appear in the film. I think it's in the Captain Stern segment, that band that's playing. That's actually Devo playing.
Oh, I thought it was Journey. The Tara.
Is that in the Tara one?
Yeah, I think it's it's in the it's in the bar where she goes to it's in the
guy's got like the weird things on his eyes.
Yeah.
That's Devo. You've got Journey, Blue Oyster Cult, Cheap Trick, Black Sabbath. Sammy Hagar does the other heavy metal theme song.
Nice.
But I love the soundtrack to this. I mean, it's definitely dated, but kind of in a good way, and it fits the film really well, I think.
Very much.
And the film also has a pretty great score. The score doesn't get talked about a lot, but the score on this was written by a legendary film composer, Elmer Bernstein, who had actually worked with Reitman on Animal House, which I'm sure is how he got the gig on this one. But the score itself it's really good for like a fairly, a kind of cheap animated film produced in Canada in the late 1970s. Like you wouldn't expect a guy like Elmer Bernstein to work on it, but he gives it his all, and it's a great score.
I literally think like this same exact time he was doing heavy metal and he was doing an American Werewolf in London.
Oh yeah, at the same time.
So just interesting side note, but
well, let's move on to the next segment. And the next segment is called So Beautiful and So Dangerous. It is once again based on a comic from the magazine. This one was written by Angus McKee. And McKee is a British artist known for his science fiction illustrations, much like someone like Chris Foss, who we talked about on our Alien episode. He did these sci-fi novel covers, these big painted things. And he did a lot of the background art for this as well. He actually worked on the film. The segment itself was directed by John Hallis, who's a Hungarian animator who's probably most well known for his work on the 1954 animated version of Animal Farm that we all had to watch in school at some point.
Yeah.
But the cast for this one, once again, features Levy, Flaherty and John Candy as a possibly circumcised robot. I don't know that we ever get an answer to that question. And also features fellow SCTV alum Harold Ramis.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Harold Ramis plays one of the aliens. So this one's weird to me because it starts off in this kind of cool segment within like the Pentagon, and this really cool painted spaceship that comes down that is straight out of Angus McKee's artwork. It's really cool, and then it just turns into like a weird stoner comedy once they get on the spaceship.
Yeah,
it's a very strange segment that I almost like watching it. I was like, did we start a new segment and I wasn't paying attention? Is this the same story?
Is this the same thing?
Is this the same story as what we were watching before? It's very strange. And it's got these two aliens who are like these Cheech and Chong guys, and they're snorting what appears to be very large lines of cocaine. But in the story is some sort of cleaning solution. It's really weird. It's a really weird story.
Yeah.
It's probably my least favorite of the whole bunch, but it's got stuff that I really like in it. Especially the first half of it before the aliens show up, I think is pretty strong. But
you were really into the robot sex.
Well, here's the thing, Gary. I'm not really into the robot sex, but let me tell you guys about my first experience watching this movie last week.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell us about your first robot sex experience. Jesus.
Well, hang on, Todd.
This episode almost took a turn.
Not finished.
Oh, okay.
So, I before I watched this movie, like an hour before I watched this movie, I took this little gummy. It was a Delta 8 gummy. Are you guys familiar with Delta 8?
I am. Yeah.
So it's a legal form of THC. And took this gummy and totally forgot. I didn't even think about it because they have a very delayed, So I start watching this movie, totally forgot that I'd done that. And then it gets to this scene, specifically the scene where the lady wakes up next to the robot and asks if he's circumcised. And that's when it clicked on.
Oh no.
So I'm watching the scene. I was like, and I'm going, what the fuck is going on right now? What is that? And then I realized, I watched the rest of the movie stoned essentially, and realized that is the best fucking way to watch this movie. I had from this segment on, even though my favorite segments actually are probably mostly the ones before, but the next one, especially the Tarna segment, especially watching that stoned is an experience. I had a blast.
Nice.
It was a fun time, but I do specifically remember it activating as soon as that robot wakes up next to that lady, which is an interesting sensation to say the least.
Interesting sensations all around.
Yeah. That's wild. Well, I mean, I guess that's the one. I mean, it's the stoned aliens like flying through space. So you might as well.
Did you guys feel the same way though, that this segment was a little more
a little disjointed?
A little disjointed. That's a good word for it. Yes.
It lost me during this segment for the most part. The biggest thing I remember from it, besides obviously the lady begs a robot, is Todd, did you notice that when they're flying,
sure did.
Okay, I was about to say the Enterprise is in the background.
What? Really?
Yeah, there's a destroyed NCC 1701, the saucer section, and the main body. The nacelles, the nacelles are broken off, but you can clearly see NCC 1701.
I thought it was going to be
with that.
Yeah, I don't know, and maybe just
it's
that
quick.
It didn't look. Yeah, maybe that it was so enough destroyed that they were like, "Oh, what do you mean?" But maybe just nobody ever noticed. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's definitely there, and you can tell. And I thought that it was because I was wondering, because they destroy the Enterprise in like Star Trek 3, so I was like, maybe this is connected. This is actually before Star Trek 3, so I don't know. Maybe they predicted Star Trek 3 too, where Kirk self-destructs the Enterprise.
Yeah.
Wow. I did not know that. I've watched this movie, I mean, over the last couple of weeks, 3 times, counting the rough cut version, but which that probably wouldn't have appeared in anyway. But yeah,
it does.
Does in the rough cut too?
Yeah, it's even in the rough cut. Yeah.
Huh.
It's this one feels real disjointed for me too. But I think the coolest part, it's so cool. It makes me want to make it my background on every screen I own is the smiling spaceship hovering
over the Pentagon.
Over the Pentagon.
Yeah, it's a great shot. It's one of my favorite shots in the whole movie.
Yeah,
it's one of my favorite images from this movie. I just wish the rest of the segment kind of lived up to it.
That. Yeah.
So the final full segment, Tarna, is an original story that was written by Daniel Goldberg and Lynn Bloom, which we mentioned before. Those were the guys who had worked on Meatballs with Reitman. And this one's not based on a specific story, but it is based on a collection of stories that was originally created by Moebius for Metal Hurlant called Arzach, Arzach, although it's actually spelled different in every issue. But these are these wordless short stories that were highly influential and remains one of Moebius's most famous creations. They're really cool. If I would urge you to look some of these up online. They're really, really cool. And it's just like wordless, it's basically the focus is about this universe that he's created, this fantasy universe. And I think this is an incredible looking sequence. I think this is the best looking sequence of the whole bunch. Just the backgrounds and everything, the technology they were using on this at the time was sort of groundbreaking. I mean, there wasn't a lot of, they didn't have motion controlled, computer controlled camera movements at this time. Yeah. But they were racking focus between foreground and background, things like that. It's really a really well animated sequence, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, and you talk, and if you listen to the creators on that documentary, they're like, yeah, it looks a little, looks a little janky now, but first of all, you can tell they really poured their heart and soul, especially into this segment. And secondly, they were using stuff like brand new technology and, really trying to make something.
The flying sequence specifically with Tarna. The way that they used that same technique like they used with the B-17 bomber, but they created a landscape that was all black with white lines on it to create these sweeping camera movements over the landscape that they would then animate her flying on the back of that dinosaur thing into. And it's really cool. And that whole segment, like you see her flying into the giant skull of some huge dead beast and then down into all these pipes and everything. Like it is a really great sequence. I think it's the
through
best
these
sequence
pipes
in the whole
to this
movie.
weird temple type place. I think this segment more than any other is ripe for ongoing series. And
and I think this segment to me, when I think of heavy metal, like Heavy Metal Magazine or Heavy Metal the movie, this is the type of imagery that comes to mind.
Yeah.
I know that the magazine tells all kinds of stories, but that fantasy world where there are giant dragons, beasts, dinosaurs, whatever you want to call them, sword and sorcery stuff, like that's the kind of imagery that comes to mind when the Heavy Metal Magazine is discussed. And I think this encompasses that more than anything else in this movie.
Yeah. Just that image of her is iconic. Just on the thing.
So the main character of Tarna was shot using rotoscope, of course, and they used this model named Carol Desbian. She's a model from Toronto, from Canada. She stood in for the character, and they basically they designed the character of Tarna and then went around all these like modeling and casting agencies looking for someone, and they're like, oh well, that's Carol. That's Carol. That you've already drawn her. And you can actually watch this footage of the rotoscoping over her, like the scene where she's putting on her outfit, which we've watched. I know you've watched the documentary, Todd, where the director is like, I just had never seen an animated movie where a woman puts on a whole outfit. I was like, and I'm thinking, why would you have seen that? He's like, I just thought it'd be really cool to show like every.
I've been searching
aspect.
for this one very specific thing my whole life.
I'm like, your idea to do this had nothing to do with hiring a beautiful model that you were then going to have to figure out how to swirl a camera around her body parts to shoot this scene. That had nothing to do with it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Animation Director, who has multiple times admitted how horny you were while making this movie, basically. But it is, I mean, it is a cool sequence. Even though it feels very superfluous, it is a very well animated sequence. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's almost feels like a slowed down version of like Ash, those segments from like the Army of Dark or the Evil Dead movies, where Ash is putting on all his gear, but it's like slowed down and sexy.
Nobody's gonna believe it
when she does the glove. If she'd have gone groovy,
nobody's gonna believe it. But I was legitimately kind of intrigued with how the outfit comes together. Like I was kind of, cool. Just like I always wondered how these work. This is like it's some superhero kind of outfit. Like it's kind of neat watching it.
It's like layers. You got the stockings and then the boots. It's a process,
right?
I don't know how Superman does it so fast in his phone booth. Because
we'll have to ask somebody to animate that.
You ever thought about that with Superman? Like, is he wearing the boots under his regular shoes?
Right.
Is he wearing those?
That's
and where's the cape? Where's the cape the whole time? Yeah. Shouldn't he just have a big bunch like under his under his suit, like just
massive, it's like sleeping blanket roll across the back of his shoulders?
Where is he keeping that thing? Anyway, if you watched this segment, hopefully you've watched the movie if you're listening to this podcast, but if you watch this, you probably noticed one specific shot that is definitely not rotoscoped, and that's the shot of the exploding house near the end. Because that house that they use, which is used at the beginning as well, it's where the astronaut lands, is they took a model and they rotoscoped the model, and it looks really cool in those segments. It has a similar look to the Corvette, like kind of realistic, but clearly painted over. So that was originally, that explosion was originally supposed to be rotoscope, but then the distribution company calls the producers and they're like, hey, can you have this done by August? And the movie was supposed to come out in November, like October, November. So all of a sudden they've cut like 2 or 3 months off of their production schedule. So that it's simply, they did not have enough time to rotoscope the house at the end, the explosion. But you know what? I think it looks really cool.
Yeah.
I think it's a really cool looking, I think that quick change from animation to live action, it just works for me. I don't know why. It just looks neat. I just think it looks very unique and very cool to me.
Yeah. And I mean, given the imagery with the Corvette and the B-17, it doesn't take you out of what's going on.
It still fits the movie.
Yeah, fits.
It really does. It still fits the movie. So Heavy Metal was released on August 7th, 1981. It was a pretty moderate success at the box office. Grossed a little over $20 million on that $9 million budget. Critical response was mixed. Gene Siskel called it a, quote, fine but disturbing cartoon, which I love. For some reason, I love that quote. I want that to be like on the video, like Gene Siskel, fine but disturbing. And Den, oddly enough, seemed to be the favorite segment among most critics, which I feel like it's one of the most inconsistent of the film.
Yeah, I think it says more about the critics than it does about the actual segment.
Yeah,
there you go.
Like
it's
watching this dude bone a bunch of ladies.
Yeah, they just want to be big buff guys that bone a bunch of ladies, and yeah, that's it.
Well, I'm curious, Gary, about some of our internet reviewers then, if they also enjoyed the Den segment or if they enjoyed the film at all. Because I feel like this is a movie that, because it does feel very dated, it feels like a product of its time. And a lot of times, especially in animation, that can lead to modern viewers not really digging it, which I can kind of understand. But at the same time, it's like, I do feel like you have to consider when the movie was made. But Gary, were you able to find some, people who might not be fans of the movie?
Well, Justin, it's the internet. So always on the internet, there's somebody that needs a nap. This is Jay Darkley says worst animated film ever.
We get a lot of those worst something evers on these segments. I feel I don't know if I don't know if that's inspired by the comic book guy from Simpsons or if they're aware that they're being comic book guy from Simpsons. But I've noticed that because as I edit these episodes, there's a lot of like worst horror movie of all time. That's a pretty hyperbolic statement to make.
That's the internet, Justin.
Of animation and rock and roll ever.
It's a really good comic book guy voice.
That was pretty solid.
Thanks.
It's no, it sounds like Twitter. I mean, Twitter is every day like this.
Yeah.
This one says, this movie is bad in every way conceivable. It's adult oriented, yet approached in a very immature manner. The animation is anywhere from sketchy to stiff and dead. The plots in each of the stories only serve the singular purpose of indulging in whatever immoral and ridiculous themes that the writers thought of. The film as a whole is just shallow and mindless, like living out some immature adolescent comic book geek's dream. You don't sit through this film, you trudge painfully through it. For a film that requires no thought whatsoever, this movie causes your head to hurt too much. Why waste time with it? There are better adult-oriented animated films from the era. See those. I would
That
like
person
examples.
is really fun at parties.
Yeah, they sound like a blast.
Yeah.
I got a couple more here. Major Boobage is the title of this review. I can't believe anybody gave this piece of crap 5 stars, for it is one of the dumbest animated movies I've ever seen, and an insult to anyone who loved Heavy Metal magazine. For those who don't know, Heavy Metal was a fantastic magazine of illustrated science fiction, fantasy, and some horror that ran from the late 70s to the early 90s, characterized by adult themes, incredible artwork, and a cutting-edge aesthetic. It was the precursor to the modern idea of the graphic novel. Unfortunately, creators of the movie decided that adult means lots of gratuitous sex and lots of boobs and some drugs and some zombies. The target market, I suppose, was boys aged 13 to 18 with an intellectual level concomitant, I've obviously fit into this group, concomitant to the amount of newly minted testosterone coursing through their bodies. But this middle school crotch level aesthetic is a betrayal of what the magazine was about and was for me a complete disappointment. And yes, I saw it as a teenager. Liked the boobs, but I hated the movie. With its cheesy soundtrack and Scooby-Doo level animation and dumbed down stories tied together by a story arc involving an evil green sphere, Heavy Metal is mildly amusing at best and boring at worst. And there is a lot of boring. If you don't want to pluck down your money, I suggest watching the South Park episode titled Major Boobage, which neatly skewers the animation style and themes of this idiotic movie in one of South Park's best parody episodes. It's a hell of a lot funnier and a lot more intelligent, and it's online for free.
That South Park episode is really good. So I'll give him that. He seems to be really fixated on being offended by the boobs in this.
I have one more, and I was going to keep them shorter, but I had to include this one because this person really needs some recognition of how much of a nap they need. Yeah. Their review title is only terrible. That's just their name. It's Wet Circuit 15. That is their name. Juvenile, mind-numbingly bland, cliched vignettes move from instant gratuitous sex to instant gratuitous war. Numerous droning speeches about war and destiny from people you don't care about. Mediocre animation that relies too much on rotoscoping. Tiny B-list radio play soundtrack and a nonsense story arc that is meant to hold it all together. This is getting a 3 out of 10. It's that bad. Side note, he gave it 1 out of 10. That's how I found this review. Heavy Metal is one of those films that fans love because of what it represents rather than what it actually accomplishes on its own. Although the source material may have been groundbreaking, the vignettes here are either boring or incoherent. The magazine was a collection of serialized adult comics, and the film attempts to show a range of those stories, each realized with different animation teams based on artwork from the publication. But the film never pulls it together as a whole and is actually weaker than its individual parts. 2 of the sequences rise above their genres. DUNE is a sarcastic take of barbarian/fantasy genre with a muscle-bound hero literally having the mind of an 18-year-old nerd, an evil queen who interrupts a battle to have sex with the hero, and a sneering gayish villain who seems ready for the whole thing to be over. But the sequence never gets a chance to LOL as a genre-challenging satire. The animation is appalling and contrasts badly with the final sequence, Tarna, which takes its fantasy pretensions seriously. In this sci-fi story, So Beautiful, So Dangerous, a scientist reporting to the Pentagon on the impossibility of extraterrestrial life turns out to be a robot planted by aliens. When he malfunctioned and is retrieved via vacuum tube to the giant spaceship that looks like a kawaii-style smiley face, a sexy Jewish New Yorker secretary is accidentally sucked aboard as well. Beautiful Dangerous is the best looking and least dated in the entire film, and the gratuitous sex is the least irksome, although there's still plenty here to cringe at. The lone horror genre piece, B-17, written by Dan O'Bannon, stands out as the most memorable sequence, told almost entirely through action and in real time. The story would feel at home in eerie or similar pulp comic from the 50s, and really is an oddity in this film. It completely ignores the Lochnar story. It is better for it. I've read it was not an actual story from the magazine. Another oddball is Captain Stern, where the life of a rogue is examined in a court trial that gets interrupted by mayhem. The character animation here is refreshingly stylized rather than rotoscoped, and the plot also dismisses the Lochnar arc. The opening sequence soft landing shows an astronaut sitting in a vintage Corvette. The animation is processed with hand-painted Xerox frames, but would have felt dated even by 1981 in the age where MTV was exhausting alternative animation methods. Like most of the film, Soft Landing is a one-punch joke that you are stuck with for too long. Harry Canyon is a cliched effort at noir, double-cross set in a future New York City where cab drivers are the baddest dudes you'll ever meet. There's a girl with an artifact, there's a gangster, there's a death ray in the back of the cab for unruly passengers. It's low-grade writing, although it's amusing to contrast this sequence with The Fifth Element, where similar cab driver/hero cliches are done with a wink and a nod. The peak sequence, Tarda, is handsomely animated, but slow and pretentious. This plot is so ridiculously unimaginative, belonging to the fantasy subgenre. Naked women in a temple with a sword that I could devote an entire review pulling this apart. Meanwhile, the filmmakers are convinced that what they are showing is so amazing that they cannot cut away or edit for narrative pacing. Long rotoscope sequences, long speeches, the title character putting on skimpy leather straps for a really long time. People you couldn't possibly have any investment in are slaughtered, probably because it takes Tarda so long to get dressed. All with monumental self-importance. The only worst sequence in this recurring story arc that is meant to hold the film together, that's Grimaldi, where the green orb Lochnar must convince a little girl how evil it is, apparently by talking her to death. That is the review. Very angry. Wrote a lot. Sorry.
At least he liked the Dan O'Bannon segment.
Yeah. Into the Dan O'Bannon part.
Regardless of what some of these, internet reviewers think, the movie obviously has fans. It's gained quite a cult following over the years. A big part of it is that it has, the soundtrack's a big part of it. The soundtrack is kind of iconic. A big part of the reason that it's become such a cult item, or at least the reason it did initially, was because it was nearly impossible to see for a really long time. Because due to rights issues surrounding the music in the film, it would be 15 years before the movie ever got released on home video. Because when the producers of the film struck a deal to use some of the songs, the deal that they struck was solely for the theatrical release. This is 1981. Video was not a big thing quite yet. I mean, it was on the cusp of being, but I think they just weren't forward thinking enough to also include that in the deal for the music. So that they weren't allowed to use, contractually, they could not use some of these songs on home video. So the movie, you obviously can't release this movie without the songs. So it just never got released on home video. It wasn't until 1996, after Kevin Eastman bought the publishing rights to Heavy Metal magazine, that an agreement was reached that allowed the film to be released on VHS and Laserdisc. So you can thank Kevin Eastman for that, among other turtley things.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you don't know who that is. He co-created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So.
Yeah, he grew up watching heavy metal, or reading heavy metal rather, the magazine. So it was a big influence on him. So yeah, he became the publisher in 1996. He sold the rights later on, but he was instrumental. The reason that we have this movie on video now is because of Kevin Eastman, working for 4 years to get it done.
Yeah. Say what you will. I mean, a lot of people were influenced by this thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then it even got a sequel eventually in 2000 called Heavy Metal FAK 2, FAKK 2 in Canada, but it was released most everywhere else as simply Heavy Metal 2000. And I don't think I've seen Heavy Metal 2000. I remember when it came out, but I don't think I ever saw it. And the reviews are pretty pretty mixed on that one.
Yeah, I don't think I ever saw it either, but it's one of these things where for Dan O'Bannon, you know, like he gets a little small part here, but I saw there was like, it was another opportunity for him to get some other stuff done, and it still didn't happen. Like I saw where him and Mobius had worked on a TV show together
based on The Long Tomorrow.
Yeah, based on
I think there was even a pilot.
Yeah. You can find the pilot online, and it just, I don't know. It stinks that it happened that way. I even found quotes from William Gibson, who, you know, invented cyberpunk, basically saying, a quote here from him says, "It's entirely fair to say that the way Neuromancer looks was influenced in large part by some of the artwork I saw in heavy metal," specifically referring to the O'Bannon and Mobius piece. "I've seen that this must also be true of John Carpenter's Escape from New York, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and all other artifacts of the style sometimes called cyberpunk."
Yeah, hugely influential. And it continues to be even now. I mean, this movie it's a cult film, but it's still kind of living on now. So there have been talks of a reboot for years, since at least 2008, when it was announced that David Fincher was spearheading the project. He was going to produce it. He had plans to have Kevin Eastman, Fincher himself, Guillermo del Toro, Zack Snyder, and Gore Verbinski all directing different segments. As that project kind of evolved, James Cameron got brought on as a producer, who was also going to direct a segment. But the project had issues getting funded, even with all these big names attached to it. They had a hard time getting funding for it. And then it was eventually actually reimagined as the Fincher produced show Love, Death, and Robots on Netflix. So eventually there's I yada over a little part of this, and that's that eventually Robert Rodriguez ended up buying the rights to Heavy Metal, saying that he was going to produce it. That hasn't happened. And I couldn't find evidence of this, but I have a feeling that the reason that the Fincher project ended up being Love, Death, and Robots is because he was already working on essentially a anthology series based on heavy metal and no longer had the rights to the Heavy Metal name because Robert Rodriguez now owned them. So it evolved into Love, Death, and Robots, which you could definitely see the influence of Heavy Metal on that. If you've watched that series, and if you haven't watched that series, I recommend it. It's pretty cool.
It's been on my list for a while. We just started Penny Dreadful, so that might be next.
Yeah, it's season 2 is about to come out, so
nice.
They just released a trailer for season 2, so it'll be coming out soon. It's very fun. Cool. Each segment, they're pretty short, about the length of the segments in this, but they just release them as like episodes, but they might be 8 minutes long, you know. Cool. But the common theme is either love, death, or robots. I mean, that's a pretty wide array of stories you can tell, and it's all various animation styles by different filmmakers. It's a really cool concept and very much shares its DNA with Heavy Metal. Well, that's it for Heavy Metal then, guys. And unless you guys have any wrap-ups, I think we all pretty much enjoyed this movie. I think we'd all seen it before, but if it was anything like me, it's been a while for all of us since we've watched this movie.
I literally don't think since high school have I seen this movie. So
it was fun to revisit it, especially knowing a little bit more about the background of it. I think it's a really cool piece of animation history and a really important piece of Dan O'Bannon's career, even though it didn't exactly lead to a bunch of other jobs, but none of his gigs seem to lead to a whole bunch of other jobs, unfortunately, for Dan O'Bannon.
Yeah, that's true. If anyone's interested, like, look, go visit your local comic book store. Heavy Metal's still running. They had a big issue 300 release.
Yeah, which is the one with the Dan O'Bannon cover, I think, isn't it? Is that the one with the zombies on the cover?
I think so. Yeah. And I've been getting them monthly, and they haven't missed a beat. It's still really good. And Tarna is still going, and I think they actually just started a Tarna series.
I was about to say, I feel like I see Tarna pop up all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Man, I do wish that I wish it was easier to find archives of Heavy Metal magazine. You know, like there's not a lot of like collected editions and things like that I could find. And I think it probably has to do with the stories being owned by the creators a lot of times, that maybe they don't have the rights to recreate them in like a collected edition. But I really wish you could find stuff like that. I mean, there are certain characters like Den that have been collected, like in a collected edition of all DUNE stories.
Right.
But I'd like to read a lot of these like one-shot stories, that you just simply can't find unless you go find the copy on eBay and spend $50 on it.
Yeah.
Which is about what they go for.
Yeah. I mean, like cover price right now is about $14.
Yeah.
So it's, it's up there. So if you're looking for vintage issues, good luck.
Yeah. Especially because they're collector's items now.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a bummer. I wish there was I wish they'd put out at least like a digital archive or something. Where you can go back and visit.
Or if they would partner up with Comixology or something like that, that'd be great.
Yeah. But they don't, unfortunately. Anyway, let's move on. Next week, we're going to continue our look at Dan O'Bannon's career. We're staying in the early 1980s, but a vastly different genre than what we talked about this week with our fantasy sci-fi animation epic. Next week, we're doing it's an action movie. It's an early 80s action movie. It's called Blue Thunder from 1983, starring Roy Schneider, not Rob Scheider. That's from
Roy Scheider.
Roy Scheider.
I mixed him up. Roy Scheider, not Rob Schneider.
Yeah.
Always mix those guys up.
Yeah,
One's
easy to
in
do.
Jaws.
And not Liev Schreiber.
Not Liev Schreiber.
He's not anywhere near it.
It's not even close.
Or D. Schneider.
Yeah.
Well, it's not even Schneider. I don't know why.
Snyder.
Anyway, next week we're talking about Blue Thunder. It's a movie about a helicopter. It's about a lot more than a helicopter, but it's a movie about a helicopter. So if you want to watch
far off.
So if you want to watch that one with us, you can find it streaming online pretty easily. Head to cinemashock.net. We'll have links to everywhere that you can stream that for yourself, so you can watch it along with us. You can also find all of our archives there on the website. I've also I recently created a new section of the website where you can see all of our themes together. So if like you want to, there's a hub where you can click on a picture and you get all of your George Romero episodes, all of your Dan O'Bannon episodes. So
nice.
So it makes it a little bit easier to kind of focus on different segments of our show if you want to. So check that out at cinemashock.net. You can also find a link there to buy our merch, our t-shirts, our hoodies, whatever else you want to wear, whatever else you want to slap a Cinema Shock logo on, a skateboard if you want. Who cares? Buy a Cinema Shock skateboard. they have the ability to exist.
Justin's trying to run some contest about which catchphrase can win the most sales. So go get your Johnny Has the Keys shirt. I actually support that one just for the sake of like it really rounds up everything I think about the world if that wins.
That we are in the darkest timeline. Oh man, but how about you guys? Where can you be found on the internet?
Go ahead, Todd.
One at a time, fellas.
Todd, how dare I?
I was gonna say, you go ahead. I'm the guest.
I don't want to come before you.
You're the guest. You're the guest for 30 shows in a row. Our most frequent guest.
Most frequent guest. I can be found at Mr. Todd A. Davis on all the socials. And if you like Star Trek, come find my podcast, the Computer Resume podcast, where we are covering the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order. It's a lot of fun.
I am at This Is Gary Horn. I also have a wrestling podcast, which you can find at TIPW Show on all the social media. There's some good stuff coming out there, I think, soon. And I just did an interview there yesterday, which I'm really excited about. I think you guys are going to dig. That goes way beyond wrestling and goes into all kinds of mental health issues and alcoholism, and it gets really deep. So I think it's worth a listen for anybody. So I just have to throw that out there. It was with a wrestler named Tom Latimer, and I think people are going to dig it.
Nice. Yeah.
Very cool.
Very cool. Did what's her name join?
Camille.
Not
this time. He said he could bring her back next time. She was in a signing in New York. Yet? He tells all kinds of stories in this podcast that he said she wouldn't have allowed if she had been sitting there. So he tells a story about getting hip tossed into a chair that broke and the leg went up his asshole. And, and so all kinds of stories that he's like, my fiance would be like, "What are you doing? Don't talk."
Why
about
are you
that.
saying this?
Lochnar!
Blame the Lochnar.
It's always Lochnar.
Well, I am at Justin_Bishop. You can find the show at cinema_shock on Twitter, Instagram. Like us on Facebook, rate, review on Apple. You can follow us on Spotify, share us with your friends, do all that stuff. And until next week,
may the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other.
Johnny has the keys.
I was expecting Lochnar has the keys.
Damn it. All right, let me take two.
Lochnar has the keys.
There you go. Gary, talk more into your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
You've been doing that, like your voice will go in and out.
Your mama lets me go in and out.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen.
There it is.
Appreciate you joining us for this episode. Oh, God.